my idea of absolute hell is to walk into a room of people who are all drinking champagne and eating canapes. And she said, yeah, I get that, but why you? Why are you, Jamie Brown?
Let's start with talking about TEDx. How nervous were you before TEDx?
Do you know what? I wasn't at all nervous. It was this long days program. There were maybe 8 people talking, 20 minutes each. It was in a big theatre in London. 800 people in the audience. And I think backstage, when they called me down to do the talk, I think they were expecting me to be really nervous. But I guess there was a few things they didn't know, which was, number one, I actually really enjoy public speaking. I'm in this quite privileged position, I guess. When I was a child, I used to have a really quite bad speech impediment. And it's got much less bad over the years, and you'll be able to hear it every now and again, but it's not terrible at all anymore. And so I feel completely free now, because when I was a child and in my 20s, talking to anybody, let alone talking to a theatre of 800 people, was terrifying. So actually, you kind of go the other way almost, and just really enjoy the fact that you're able to do it physically as well as emotionally. So that's one thing. I had an excellent speech coach who helped me not only to craft what I wanted to say and put it into a great structure, but also sort of helped me prepare for the whole thing, which was so useful. And lastly, when I walked out onto stage to 800 people in a theatre, all the lights were on me and you literally can't see anybody in the audience. So it was like talking to myself in my bedroom.
Well, then explain to me, why is it that you're slightly nervous right now? Is it that you're lacking the 800 people, or is it that there's too much light on me, or what's the difference?
It's the middle point. I haven't prepared my speech, so I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. I don't know exactly what you're going to ask me. That's where the nerves are.
I can totally imagine myself. I think you mentioned that you were like 8. Like there were 8 speakers on the day. Yeah. Like if I had to be waiting, I think the longer I wait for something, the more nervous I get. Especially if, for example, I see that the other speakers are doing such a great job, and then I would feel like, oh my gosh, am I going to at least match their level? Like it's worse.
Do you know what was really interesting? I was on maybe number 6 out of 8, I think. And I thought I was going to go to the theatre, have my sound check first thing in the morning, and then watch the first 5 presentations. And actually, they specifically told me to not. So I did my sound check, and then they said, okay, take yourself off somewhere, calm down, and we'll see you back here in 4 hours. Which is actually really great advice, for a TEDx or for speaking at a conference or anything like that. It's not very helpful at that point, I think, to compare yourself to other people. Even if you're interested in what they're going to be talking about, I don't think it's the best preparation. And nowadays, usually there's a recording happening. So if you do end up missing something you wanted to hear, then you can always watch it afterwards.
I think you might be, hopefully I'm not making a mistake here, I think you might be the first person who ever did a TEDx talk that I got to interview. Tell me, how does one person come to such an opportunity?
How did I get the opportunity to speak at TEDx? Good question. I think, particularly in the UK, What3Words is a very recognisable product. Most people now in the UK have heard of What3Words. Very many people have used it. And I guess it's it's such a neat bit of tech. Everybody who hears about it is blown away by the simplicity of the idea and the numerous ways in which it could be useful to them or in situations that they can understand. So everyone really wants to talk about it. So talking about What3Words is easy because there's so much to say and people simply find it interesting. And languages, I guess, as well. Like the majority of people in the world have language, can use language, speak every day. And people are generally pretty interested in it. And What3Words in languages is also a very sort of interesting corner of two interesting things. So yeah, they asked me to.
So does that mean that somebody asked you or someone from What3Words to come and give a talk? Or does it work that you as a person can, I don't know, apply somewhere to give a speech and they select people?
I believe you can apply. I, like you say, was actually invited to do it. But yes, I mean, there's TEDx franchises around the world, and I believe lots of them will take applications to curate whatever program they're hoping to put together.
When you said that there's so much to say about What3Words, I guess we'll talk about it later. But when it comes to your talk, since you had so much to say, how did you select the things that you wanted to put into your speech, and what are the things that maybe you left out and you wish you didn't?
Interesting. I think so. Like I said, I had this incredible speech coach called Tara Majumdar, and she helped me in so many ways to put together the talk that it eventually became. Draft one was not that talk. It went through a lot of process. Draft one was really the standard What3Words presentation. And it's one that I give very often to people all around the world. And Tara really helped me to tease out what was important and also what fit their program. Like I said, they'll be curating a program for the day. And the theme of this one was called Life Finds a Way. So they were really looking at sort of how individuals achieve stuff because of their backgrounds, I guess. And so, you know, one of the things that really sticks in my mind is I had this talk and I was very pleased with it, and it was a very standard What3Words presentation, really. And I went through it and I sort of stopped and was pleased with myself and waiting for her reaction, and I kind of expected sort of praise and adulation. And she said to me, great, that's all really interesting, but why you? And I said, well, because I'm the head of languages at What3Words.
Duh.
And she said, yeah, I get that, but why you? Why are you, Jamie Brown, the individual, not your job title? Why are you giving this talk? And I stopped and I was like, I didn't really understand the question at first. And I took it away, and all of a sudden I realized, and I don't, there's no particular reason to dwell on this one fact, but I realized that it was because I grew up with a speech impediment that made me want to get into language and linguistics and localization. It made me, very interested in giving people a voice that didn't necessarily have one. And I feel very strongly that to use a lot of tech in the world nowadays, you need to be able to speak English or one of the other major languages. And I wanted to be the person who was taking technology truly global, in the sense that, if you are monolingual or trilingual or whatever, but not in any of the big languages that the major tech products are localized into. I wanted to be the one that was helping you to use them, basically. Yeah, yeah. So that's why me, I guess.
Is there anything else that you learned from your speech coach that you maybe apply in your day-to-day communication with your team?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think, we talked a lot about context and a lot about, don't assume that somebody you're talking to understands the full 360 of what you're trying to say. Be very clear. Make sure you're bringing the audience with you, and that's the same if it's a theatre of 800 people or an internal company presentation or a team meeting with the two people that report into you, or an online tutorial, anything it is. But, engaging with what your audience want to know, I think, in a way that makes them curious about it, was something that she left a big mark on me with, I think.
You mentioned that your speech impairment kind of like is one of the reasons why you got into localization. So this is a typical question that I ask almost everyone. How did you get into localization? Where did you first, maybe as a child or teenager, started seeing interest in languages?
Really interesting question. For me, it was a very long and winding path.
We have two. That's why I booked you for 2 hours. Jamie's origin story. Let's start now.
I am going to go off topic many times in the next 2 hours. But honestly, it was a very long path. As a child, I was very interested in language, really only to the level that I learnt languages at school. We did French. I then learnt Spanish and a bit of German later on. And I was always very interested in them, and I was interested in the way that they worked, and I was interested in how you can express yourself using words. Particularly, like one thing I really love is words that other languages have that English hasn't. And I was kind of really interested in the way that language facilitates expression, and different languages can be expressed in different ways, I guess. I was never very good at speaking them out loud for obvious reasons. So I never thought that it was an avenue that I could really go down. I didn't think languages was for me because I wasn't able to speak them out loud with my stammer. So what does somebody who can't speak study? Is music. So I was a classical musician. I did classical music at university. I worked in the opera industry for a few years. And then in my late 20s, I wanted to take a bit of a 180 and basically quit my job, stuck a pin in the map, and moved to Brazil. And it was sort of only when I arrived in Brazil off the plane that it occurred to me that I didn't really know many people in Brazil. I didn't have any money, and I couldn't speak Portuguese. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, it's a really bad idea. But because I've always been interested in languages, I was actually able to pick up Portuguese really quite easily. And I progressed in it very quickly, and my speech impediment was sort of leveling out a bit at that point. And actually, most people I knew complimented me on how my Portuguese was, because they knew that I hadn't been learning it for long, and that I was basically fluent in a few months, and it was all going really well. And honestly, at the age of 28, that was the first time that anybody had ever complimented me about my speech. So I was like, oh wow, this is great. So I was in Brazil for about a year, came back to the UK, instantly did a master's in linguistics because I realized actually it was a thing that I always had been the most interested in, but I just felt wasn't something that was available to me. And then, started the job at What3Words only a couple of years after I did my master's. That's why I'm now.
Why Brazil? Was it really just random? Like you just, there, or did you use your brain?
Use my brain a little bit. I did know a couple of people in Brazil, and the other thing was I knew I didn't want to go to a country that I could sort of speak the language already, and I could sort of speak. Well, I spoke French quite well. I spoke Spanish at school, and I sort of wanted to go to South America, and I didn't want to go to a Spanish-speaking country, so Brazil was kind of the obvious choice.
I like when you said that it was the first time somebody complimented you on you talking. I'm not sure if this is somewhat related to it, but I remember when I first moved to Singapore, I felt like it's a place where maybe I could belong to for the first time. Did you have similar feeling in Brazil just because you felt like maybe you could talk to the people, even though you didn't know the language perfectly? But was a speech impairment something that you felt like was limiting you before Brazil? And like Brazil is the one that, I don't know, opened your mind, or like you started thinking differently about yourself and your like what you can do with your speech.
Yeah, no, you're 100% hit the nail on the head. I'd never thought of it in quite those terms. But yes, you're absolutely right. It had always limited me up until I went there, and then sort of worlds were opened, I guess, by feeling like speech and language was something that I was able to do. And also, Brazil is it's a very open-hearted country. I'm also quite shy, and one of the things that really struck me about Brazil when I moved there was sometimes you'd be sitting around a table, you'd have been asked to go to a bar in the evening, and you'll arrive and there'll be maybe 10 or 12 people there already, and you'll all be sitting around having a beer. And in Brazil, there's absolutely no way of knowing which people around the table already knew each other, which people are lifelong friends or brothers or relatives, and which people are literally meeting each other for the first time because they interact with each other in exactly the same way. And I found that really lovely because that is not the case in the UK, let me tell you. And it allows shy people to feel included, and to feel like they're not the ones that have to break into a particular social situation. So it's interesting, like your question, and you said about moving to Singapore, a place that you sort of feel fits you. I don't know if I felt like Brazil fit me, but I felt like it welcomed me in, I guess, in kind of in the way that I wanted to be welcomed into a place. And maybe I hadn't realized before, but yeah.
So then why did you decide to move back to the UK? Was it really just to pursue the studies? Did you miss the life back in UK?
I did. Good question. I don't think I missed the life in the UK, and there's certainly. I mean, we're talking 15 years ago now, but there's certainly things that I still miss about Brazil. I don't think I ever really intended to be there long term. I've got a very large and close family who are all based in the UK. So I was there for about a year, and then I wanted to come back and sort of apply what I'd learned in Brazil, I guess, but also get back into family life and the friends I've got in around the UK, I guess. No, I was going to say, I mean, you know as well as anyone, like living in a country that isn't your home is a very interesting and rewarding thing to do. Um, I had a friend who lived in, so she's also British. She did Spanish at university, moved to Mexico for, gosh, like maybe 7 or 8 years, and is now living in Spain. And she said the decision to leave Mexico, where she'd basically made her life, and to move back to Europe. And again, because Spain is easier to get to the UK from, and her parents lived here, and she's very close to them, and wanted that opportunity in her life again. But she said, and I'll always remember it. She said, leaving Mexico was like ripping one of my own legs off. Because it is, you make it your home, and it's a very hard decision to move away from that.
One more question about this whole Brazil experience. When you mentioned how the social circles work like in Brazil, that you don't know if the people have a long-term relationship or no, do you think it's just a mindset thing? Like, is that something that once you experienced it in Brazil, you can basically apply it anywhere? Because I have to be honest, that is one of the fears that I usually have, is like when you are new to a certain group of people and you feel, like, at least in your head, that they all know each other for so long and you're not part of the group yet. Maybe you're going to be restricting yourself, like what you say, how you behave, and so on. So with your experience after Brazil, is that something that maybe, I don't know, when you go to a networking event or somewhere where you don't know anyone, do you feel like, okay, this is like Brazil, like, I don't know if the people know each other. I'm just going to be myself. I'm not going to be shy. Or once you came back to the UK, you sort of knew how the UK circles work like. And it's always in the back of your head that, okay, these people probably know each other for so long. They're close friends. What am I doing here?
Yeah. I'm certainly much less shy than I was in my 20s. I don't know if I could genuinely put that all down to having lived in Brazil. I think, people generally get less shy as they get older. I'm certainly still terrible at networking. I mean, like, my idea of absolute hell is to walk into a room of people who are all drinking champagne and eating canapes, and having to walk up to them and introduce myself out of the blue. That is like absolutely the worst thing you could possibly ask me to do for an evening. So I don't think I've become fully Brazilian, but
Okay. But why is it such a terrifying image for you to do that?
I mean, isn't it for anybody?
Well, if you think about it from the, I don't know, curiosity perspective, like, there are so many new people, interesting, they could know a lot of different things, they could teach you something. Is it just the whole image of people, I don't know, drinking champagne so they look like they are snobs? Or why is it such a bad image for you?
I think in those kinds of networking events, part of it is the fact that most people are already having a conversation. So there's like little pockets of people around the room, and they're all talking, and they've all introduced themselves already. And finding your in to go and introduce yourself and to sort of infiltrate that conversation.
Well, you should have it very easy. Hey, I'm Jamie. I did a TEDx talk. Take me
Yeah,
in.
yeah, right. Yeah, well, we do. But to an English person, like, the idea of interrupting somebody else's conversation because you want to be in the conversation as well is like, so. I mean, yeah, there's a very cultural barrier there, and I'm sure English people aren't the only nationality that have that problem. But yeah, it's a hard thing to do for sure. For sure.
All right. Let's talk about What3Words. What is it? For people who don't know about it. And I think I mentioned to you during our intro call that I once read about it, but otherwise, if I didn't read that article, I also wouldn't have any idea What3Words is about. So how would you explain What3Words for to a 5-year-old. Have you ever prepared such a such a speech?
I have to admit, for the 5-year-old crowd, probably not, but I'll give it a go. Basically, have you ever been in a situation where you wanted to tell somebody exactly where you were, but you didn't have any way of communicating that? So, I live in a town in the UK. We have very good street addressing here. So if somebody wants to write me a letter or post me a parcel, then I can tell them my street address, and that letter or parcel is going to end up in the right place. Even in the UK, that's not always the case. In the countryside, addresses won't always take the postman exactly to the right place. They sometimes, end up on the other side of the valley or something like that. And so if you can tell the postman exactly where they need to go to the nearest 3 meters, then that's going to help everybody. It's going to help him not get lost. It's going to help you receive your parcel on time. If, for example, you crash your car in the middle of the countryside and you ring 999 or 911 in Canada, I guess, and they say, "Where are you?" And you say, "Well, I don't know. I'm on the main road between these two towns, but other than that, I'm a stranger to the area. I can't tell you. I can see some trees and a field and some cows, and that's all I can tell you." How are you going to tell them exactly where you are? Because in that situation, you can't drop a pin on a map and show it to them either. GPS coordinates, long string of numbers, are very precise, but they're not very human friendly, particularly over the phone, particularly in that sort of stressful situation where you're in some trouble and you need to tell somebody quickly where you are. Reading those numbers out, there's all kinds of problems that can happen. What3Words is a human-friendly solution to that. So basically, what the company have done is divide the entire world into 3-meter squares. There's an awful lot of them, and assigned every single square a unique address that is made up of 3 random words. So, for example, my front door of my house is Puff Twin Ties, and that's the only 3-meter square in the entire world that has that exact What3Words address. So if I say to anybody, I live at Puff Twin Ties, they can type that into their What3Words app, and it'll show them my front door, accurate 3 meters. If you're in the middle of the countryside and you've rung 911 and you have to tell the call handler where to find you, get the app on your phone, read out the words, they can put it into their system, and hey presto, they know exactly where you are to within 3 meters. And that's really it. It's a very simple concept, but it's one that really is being useful and saving lives around the world. I joined very early, actually. I think it was founded in 2013. I joined as a freelance project manager in 2014 and then became full-time a year after that. Because by that time, I was home from Brazil. I had done my master's in linguistics. I was working in a research center. And so they brought me in because they knew that they wanted to go global. The company's ambition has always been to be the global standard for addressing. And the founders knew instinctively, What3Words is a very unique product in that words and language are literally the product itself. Usually words and translations of them are simply sort of the user interface that allows somebody to use a product. But in the sense of What3Words, I mean, it literally is the product. So they knew that if they were ever going to go global, they really had to cover as much of the world and speakers and languages as they could. So they brought me in really quite early on to work on initially new language versions, which is a whole process in itself that I'm sure we'll cover in a while. But then also later on, the localization. So really, what other companies talk about when they talk about localization. So marketing asset translation, transcreation, translation of product user interfaces, that kind of thing. And also my team work on sort of the more language technology side of things now. So speech input across many languages, OCR, sort of scanning with your phone, different languages and writing scripts, input methods, that kind of thing. So we've got quite a broad remit now. But I was initially brought on to do that sort of linguistic research, I guess, building the product in other languages.
And when you joined, was it just pure English for the product, or did they already have some?
They had a couple of other beta versions. So it was available in Spanish, Russian, and Swedish. So 4 languages. And then we built on from there. And now, 8 years later, we've just launched language number 55.
When you joined, so this is a bit of surprise to me because I thought that you were the one who put the first language in. When you joined, did you think the process of how they added the languages before you was adequate, or was there a lot of room for improvement?
I mean, there's always room for improvement, right? They had a very robust process. They knew the product that they wanted to create. They knew the things that a What3Words address should be and the things that a What3Words address should not be. And they put procedures in place to make sure that the words that you see in a What3Words address are ones that we think should be there. So, for example, we try very hard to remove negative, offensive vocabulary. We try to remove words that could be confusing when spoken out loud. So, for example, the word sail in English, you could write that down SAIL, or you could write it down SALE. And in that use case of ringing 911, you don't want to have to be explaining to the call handler which version of the word sail you mean. So they're homophones, and we try very hard to remove homophones as well from our product to make sure that people don't have that confusion. And lots of other things. So they had put all those processes into place, and they thought very hard about what sort of words they wanted, what sort of words they wanted to exclude. I guess where I came in was really twofold. The first being that I understand a lot of languages, and as a linguist, I understand how they work, how they're put together. I know that many, if not most, languages in the world have a more complicated grammar than English does. In most other European languages, if you're talking about the different forms of a verb, for example, in English, you've got walk, walks, walked, walking, and that's basically it. And they all feel like very basic forms of the word, they're very clear what they are, none of them would feel particularly out of place or unusual as part of a What3Words address. But in lots of languages, it gets much more complicated, and particularly with verbs, there may be 40, 50, 60 plus forms of the same verb once we're talking about tenses and people and all the rest of it. And actually, a What3Words address could well start to feel very clunky if it was, for example, I will walk, you walked, they are going to walk. And that's a very personal thing to people. What creates a What3Words address that you would expect a What3Words address to be is a very unique thing to different people. But understanding that and putting processes in place to not only choose the appropriate words for What3Words, but also make sure that they're in forms that are user-friendly to people who speak that language, is quite a complicated thing. So that's one thing that I added to their process, I guess. And I said there were two things. So I've got to tell you the other thing that's gone clean out of my mind right now. Oh, yeah. So training teams. I think one thing that I'm a big advocate of in localization in general, particularly building new language versions of What3Words, is I want to speak to the people that are doing the job for me. Because, for a lot of reasons, I think it's the right thing to do to have a relationship with freelancers that are working with you. I also can't look at our new Slovak language version of What3Words and make a judgment on whether the native speakers that have helped us to create it did a good job or not. So I'm a really big advocate of having a personal relationship with people, knowing that you've trained them well, knowing that they've had opportunity to ask anything that isn't clear or challenge you if you say something that they don't necessarily agree with, because I don't speak the vast majority of languages that we work on. So what I can go on is experience from other languages, but that's not always relevant. So having that training and personal relationship and large team as well. When we started working with a lot more linguists in each language to get a real broad understanding of how that language community uses those words. So yeah, that's number two.
Okay. We can get back to that a little bit later. For now, what I'm interested in, and I'm not sure if you can answer this because this technically happened before you joined, but can you maybe describe to us how the selection of the words worked for the language number one, the very first original, let's say, source language? Like how do they pick the words?
I was not there for this, as you rightly say. I believe that. So basically, if you're trying to end a project with a particular number of words, but you know that you're going to exclude some words for particular reasons, the obvious thing to do is to start with too many words and allow yourself to take them out where it's appropriate to do so. So it was mostly done by people, founders, people who were working in What3Words in the early stages, people who had that very clear vision of the product that they were intending to create, and the reasons why they would want to take words out of that database.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question. It may be a stupid question. Some questions are stupid. Well, let's not get into the debate. Okay, so what you guys do is completely different than what, let's say, the mainstream localization, teams do. And with localization, we usually talk about internationalization. How should the English be written so that it's easier to localize or to translate and so on. My question that might be stupid is, was there ever a case, is it even possible? I think no, but I'm still going to ask, where let's say the English words had to be changed later on, or is it just you decide on the words once and then it's set in stone? Maybe we can expand this to any other language, right? Like, is it possible to update the words because at some point you realize something doesn't work, or would it cause too much confusion for the end users?
They're set in stone, so we don't change words in a What3Words address ever. For a number of reasons. Number one, it would be annoying if you'd written your What3Words address on your business card and then had to reprint them all. Also, because the app works offline, which is extremely important, particularly for that emergency services use case, you don't have to have a data connection to use What3Words. So we can't go changing the words in the product and changing the addresses because you need a data connection to update it, and you might not have one.
Okay, good. You answered my question. So now that we know that the words are set in stone, I assume that the process that leads to that needs to be somewhat thorough before you actually finalize the words. So we already touched on that a little bit, but now I guess it's the right place to start talking about how do you actually add a new language? What is the process? What does your team do? How do you collaborate with the freelancers and so on?
Yeah, really good question. And you make a very good point. The languages team at What3Words, we only get one shot. V1 is it. There can't be any bugs because we're not going to fix them.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite important this distinction, right? Because like everything that I do in my experience, software, apps, marketing, you can always update it, right? That's a huge difference. There's like a lot of pressure, I would say, for you to make it right.
It is huge. Yeah, like with anything else, if you spot a typo in your copy, you'll just change it in the next update, easy. If you roll out a new product feature and it crashes for people, then debug it, great. It is the pressure point of languages work at What3Words. And the way we get around it is really we are just very, very, very careful. We check and check and check again. So with every word that ends up in our final product, it isn't the case that one person has approved it for being suitable. It isn't the case that two people have, or even 3, 4, or 5. We're really going to some quite surprisingly high numbers of people looking at every single word to be absolutely sure that it's a word that we want to have in our word list.
Can you give me an idea of how many people actually review the list of words?
Yeah, I mean, it's double figures. Basically what we do, so to answer your other question, and to go back to the beginning of a new language project, I guess some people might look at What3Words from the outside and just assume, these guys have found a list of words in a language, plugged it into their algorithm, crossed their fingers, and away they go. That isn't the case. So we do a lot of things. We work with a lot of people that speak that language. We train them all up in not only what What3Words is and how it works, but also our vision for What3Words in that language. We take their input as well in terms of how we might structure the project, what kinds of words are okay, what kinds of words aren't okay. So they really help us form our strategy for that particular language. And it's not always straightforward. Sometimes there are things, there are real hurdles that have to be overcome, and some quite creative decisions made to make What3Words work in that language, because it's not a given that a language will be What3Words friendly, I guess. A good example would be Japanese. I don't know if you speak any Japanese.
I was just playing a Japanese game yesterday, and my roommate is Japanese, but no, I don't speak Japanese, but I hear a lot of Japanese recently.
Okay. So Japanese has got 3 writing scripts, which are all sort of used together when writing language. It isn't sort of one or the other. They're all used kind of alongside each other to write written Japanese. Japanese words, one of the writing scripts is kanji, which is basically characters that come from Chinese characters. And the problem with this and What3Words is that using those characters in written Japanese will very, 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 very frequently create words that are homophones of each other. So words that sound the same but can be written in 2 or more ways. And that's bad for What3Words because, as I said earlier, we remove words like that from our product. So what we did in Japanese, for example, with the input of our Japanese-speaking language team, was we made the decision to actually only use one of the Japanese writing scripts. So we write everything out in hiragana, which is a phonetic writing script, and each of the characters in it represents one syllable, and that's the only way to represent that syllable on paper. So that essentially removes any homophones from the written language. So that's one way in which we really need those native speakers to help us to formulate the language strategy, to come over any hurdles that might trip us up. Because there's no way I could have made that choice on my own because I don't speak Japanese. I've got no idea how Japanese people would react to seeing words that they're more commonly used to seeing written in kanji, written out in hiragana. And actually, as it turns out, they're completely fine with it, and it's a very elegant solution, which is great for us. So we've got a big team of linguists. We try and sort of represent the entire language community because we're trying to create something that feels user-friendly, regardless of who you are. We understand that while everybody may speak the same language as an umbrella, actually you all speak language in very different ways. My niece is 25 years old, and she sometimes uses words that I've never heard of, and I'm only 42. I'm not, there's not a huge amount of years between us, but we don't use the same English as each other. And I guess part of our process is we're trying to create a product that feels created for you personally, regardless of how old you are or what part of the world you come from or what part of the country you live in you're from, because all those factors will affect the language that you use. We're collecting a lot of data about each word and using that to create the most user-friendly product that we can.
Do the language teams in any way work with the, let's say, original set of the English words, or like the whole idea of source and target is completely irrelevant for you?
Completely irrelevant. That's actually one thing I probably should have said a bit earlier, is that each of our language versions is actually totally independent from all of the other language versions. So my 3-word address at my front door in English is puff twin ties. If you flipped the language in the app to any of our other 54 languages, the words you find in the same square won't be translations of those English words. And that's for a number of reasons, but the main one, I guess, being that, as you know, you simply can't translate one word in one language neatly into one word in every single other language on the planet. It just doesn't work like that. We might have had the word snowman in our English list, but in French that translates to bonhomme de neige, which is 3 words all in itself. So it's simply not possible to do. Or it might translate to a word that is actually then a homophone in another language, or has a double meaning, and the other meaning is a very offensive one, or something like that. So the decision was made right from the beginning to not even try and use English as any kind of source text, but rather create every single language we have from scratch completely independently, which then also allows us the opportunity to build something bespoke for that language community that feels like we've really considered how they use their language and the kinds of things that would make it user-friendly to them specifically.
Mm-hmm. How many words are we talking about? How many is it in total to cover the whole Earth?
To cover the whole Earth, you need 40,000 words, which is a lot of words.
So what is the, I don't know, technology behind it? So you put together these big teams for each different language. How do they insert the words? How do you have them review the words that other people suggested? Do you have some sort of like a platform for it? Or are you using by any chance spreadsheets for that? The notorious spreadsheet.
We're not using spreadsheets, no. We do have a linguistic coding platform, I guess, that then collects the data that then I can use at the end of the project to work out which words should be in the product and which words shouldn't. Yeah, we're also able to tell our algorithm that for particular languages, the short and common words would go in one particular part of the world, and the longer and less common words would go in another. When you're talking about that number of words, not everything in that group is going to be short, everyday table, chair type words. So there are going to have to be some of those longer or more cumbersome words. But we try and make sure that they're used in places where people probably won't be using that language version of What3Words.
How do you decide on which language should be added next?
A number of reasons. One would be we look at the major languages of the world. What languages will provide us with the best reach around the world? How many speakers will we be engaging by launching this particular language? So it's about that commercial opportunity, and it's about, like I said at the beginning, becoming a global standard and trying to get to that magic number of every single person in the world being able to use What3Words. We're doing pretty well so far. Of course, it's a very hard thing to try and quantify, but we think we are over 5 billion people can now use What3Words in their native language, which is great. Obviously, it's not everybody yet, but we're getting there. So that's one thing. Another very important consideration would be if there's a particular commercial opportunity to do so. People are often surprised that I think the 9th language we launched was Mongolian. And with most tech companies, the 9th language they choose to localize into isn't Mongolian, particularly in Europe. But that was because the National Postal Service of Mongolia were in touch, and they said, we want to integrate you. We want people in Mongolia to use it and to be able to post letters to a 3-word address. But obviously that's going to have to be in the Mongolian language. So that's why it was so early. So we're looking at those sorts of opportunities as well. Yeah, those would be the main two.
I would now like to talk about the people that you work with that help you put these words together. You talk about them. Of course, obviously, they're very critical for what you guys are doing. How do you find them? Or let's say, I don't know, somebody's listening to this interview and, their language is not covered by What3Words yet. How can they, I don't know, how do people start working with you? Do you reach out to them? How do you find them? Can they apply somewhere?
The first thing to say is, if anybody is interested and we haven't offered your language yet, find me on LinkedIn, drop me a message, and I'll take your details. Usually, we would be more focused in terms of so the first thing we do really in a language project is we'll start researching the language to understand its structure, to answer particular questions that we might need to know. Is there a standardized spelling? Are homophones likely? What writing script is it in? That kind of thing. And we'll also be recruiting for our team who will end up joining us and be trained and be working on the strategy and choosing the words. We'll look in all of the usual places that you might look for a linguist or a translator or a proofreader or whatever you want to say. We would look on LinkedIn. We very often go to universities and places that speak that language, try to find people through those avenues. We don't exclusively work with linguists. We do have a lot of linguists on each team, and everybody has to be, a language enthusiast and pride themselves on their spelling and grammar, I guess. But at the end of the day, yes, this is a linguistic exercise, but it's also a product building exercise, and it's an exercise in creating a user-friendly product. And not everybody who uses What3Words is a professional linguist. So really, on those teams, we also want the opinions of people who aren't trained in linguistics to understand how that language is being used across the board.
How long does usually the engagement with the linguists take?
Depends on the language sometimes. Some languages are quicker than others. Some languages, there's more for us to learn about that language than others. Some languages are better resourced online than others. The quickest it would be, I would say, from the very beginning, starting to research the language, starting to recruit a team, to being able to launch it publicly in our apps, I would say is 5 or 6 months. It's not a quick process, we take a lot of care and pride in creating these things. We want to treat the languages with the respect that they deserve. And we take our time doing it to make sure that we do it right. Some languages will take much longer. We've had language projects that have taken a year.
Mm-hmm. Is there any language that you wish you already had, but you still don't have it? It's like a personal goal of yours one day?
There's the Cornish language, which is spoken in the southwest of England, which is a part of the world that I'm from. I would very much like to be able to offer What3Words in Cornish. When you're talking about engaging new users and looking at speaker numbers around the world, Cornish isn't a big hitter. So there's a very good reason that we haven't yet. But one day, I think my sort of little personal passion project might be to create a Cornish language version of What3Words. Because also, I think, I'm very passionate about endangered or minority languages. We were very pleased that we have actually done Welsh language project because of emergency services in the UK. If you are a speaker of Welsh, you have the right to be able to ring 999 and speak to the call handler in Welsh. And so you then should also be able to give them a Welsh language 3-word address rather than an English one. So we have a Welsh language version. And I think it's really important, these languages that whose use has diminished over the years, I think keeping them alive and helping people to have ways in which they can use them in their everyday life, I think is actually a very important thing. So that's something that I personally very much enjoy when we're able to facilitate that with What3Words.
Maybe from a different bucket, your role is officially a Chief Language Services Officer. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is that I've seen a few posts on LinkedIn where people are sort of arguing or they're suggesting that, people from localization team should have a seat with the other chief people because they are very important for the business, but they all feel that localization is still being looked at like a service or like an afterthought rather than someone who deserves an equal seat. So what does this position mean to you? Do you think like you are in a better position than, let's say, the mainstream localization teams as a chief person?
I think it's huge, to be honest. As you say, Chief Language Services Officer isn't a very common job title. Not many people have it, and I'm very fortunate to be in that position, but also to work for a company that takes language so seriously. I think that's quite an unusual thing, to be honest. But this all comes back to, like I said a while ago, words are literally the product, and our founders' sort of ambition right back at the very beginning of the entire project was to become a global standard for addressing. And they recognized very early on and feel very strongly that language and localization is a very big part of that. So I'm personally very fortunate to work for a company like that. I very deeply sympathize with people in my role who work for companies who aren't quite in that mindset. I completely agree that localization or language professional has a very unique voice and part to play in that senior management team. And I like to think that I offer that to What3Words. And if there's one major bit of change that I would like to bring to industry, I guess, it would be to increase the number of people who are sitting at that senior table from the language industry. How we do that, I think, is maybe a longer term play. And, it's about proving the worth, I guess. But I think it's hugely important.
What does your current position allow you to do that maybe you wouldn't be able to do? Let's imagine that you were just a localization manager, hypothetically speaking.
I think it provides me with the opportunity to have that direct channel into the people that are making the decisions. And, I include myself in that. I am part of the team that makes decisions for the company. I try and make sure that localization and language, but also I think more broadly that sort of wider consideration of people around the world. So language is a big part of that, but culture is another very big part of it. And I like to think that I'm able to bring that consideration when we're talking about a vast number of things.
How do you think people who are not so fortunate as you how should they, I don't know, convince the rest of the chief officers that they should have a say in what the company does? Like they should be equal partners to them.
I think there's a number of things you can do. I don't think there's one magic answer. I think evangelize. I think talk about what you do, make sure that people know and understand what you do and appreciate it, and are brought into that process. I think one thing that I don't think is necessarily a mistake, but I think one thing that often happens in companies is that people submit a brief for localization that goes to a localization manager, and then something happens over here in some black box, quite often done by people who aren't employees of the company, and then it comes back in a form that the person that briefed it in can't QA it. They can't understand the language. And actually bringing people into that process, helping people realize the kinds of things that go into creating a very good localized version of whatever it is, the kinds of things that a translator team, be they in-house or not, are thinking about and looking at, and the care in which content that was created by a company is localized for other markets, I think is a really important thing. And I don't think it hurts for people to understand that. I think showing how you add value, I think, is another really big thing that localization professionals should be doing. Showing how they are supporting those market entries into countries that were otherwise out of the realms of possibility for that company. Get your hands on any data you possibly can to show why localization matters. One thing that we've looked at a lot is cost per installs in the App Store. So how much you have to spend to get one person to download the app, essentially, and then iterate that localization, and then test again to see whether the cost per install has gone up or down. Change it around, understand those markets. Is it? It's not necessarily just the text. Like, are the images that you're using in the App Store, are they the ones that are enticing people to download your app or not? Things like that. But find those numbers that show people that what you're doing can change the goalposts for your company.
Well, that was the question that I was thinking about, because many times when I talk to people about this, mostly on the podcast, especially the ones who are on the vendor side, they always say, get your data, show the value in terms of numbers or in terms of dollars. Do you also agree with that? Do you think that using the numbers and dollars and profits is the strongest argument, or is there something that you can bring maybe that's more on a, I don't know, personal or emotional level to why people should be doing stuff? Or is it really just about justifying the business, I don't know, costs and potential profits? Because I can imagine that in your case, like, since you mentioned this whole thing about, I mean, your story with speech impairment and how it maybe drives you, there's that element to that, I would assume, in how you talk to other people. It's not only about, okay, let's get What3Words everywhere so that we can make money or so that everybody can talk. I don't know. What are your thoughts on what I just said?
No, I completely agree. There is a human element, and there's a human element to everything a company does, and it's not always about the bottom line. I don't think. I think I'm very fortunate at What3Words that I have quite a high profile within the company. People know who I am. I talk internally to the whole company pretty often. what I do is a very interesting part of the company. And most people who work at What3Words are pretty into languages and culture. That's just the kind of people that are attracted to work there. And they like hearing about the stuff that the localization language services team do. So it's a pretty easy win. And honestly, I think it is an easy win, generally speaking. That most people are interested on some level in languages in a way that actually that's not necessarily true of, I can't think of any particular examples, but like sales techniques or building new technology or coding or finance, like they're all interesting things, but I think language is a much more universally interesting topic. The vast majority of people in the world use language every day. They speak language, they write language. Um, they understand what language is. They have this sort of instinctive understanding of language. And they find localization interesting, but you have to talk to them about it. And you have to talk to them about it in a interesting and engaging way, and in a way that they are going to understand and find those hooks to hook onto. And then once you've got the whole company interested and they're all evangelizing on your behalf as well, then it's a sort of swell of momentum, I guess. It helps. It helps with everything. It helps localization professional to be looped into projects earlier because people can see the value that talking to your localization manager early on in the project rather than at the end of the project when you're submitting a brief for localization, they can see the value of that. They had those conversations. They understand the kinds of things that translators might be asking or need clarification on. They understand what sort of structures of an English source copy might not work for localization purposes. They, that kind of thing. So really getting people to talk about languages and localization in your company is a really key thing. And honestly, I don't think it's a particularly hard thing to get people excited about.
Well, maybe it's easy for you because you're the enthusiast. That was actually my question. So, is there actually any language that you don't like?
I don't like. Absolutely not. I like every language. No, I mean, seriously, I think every language, I we've worked on 55 plus languages over the last 8 years, me and my team. We've traveled the world and we've talked to 3,000 or 4,000 plus in super interesting people and found out everything we need to know about their language and their culture and their country and their communities. There's always something new to learn or to understand about a language. Every single language, you might start a new language project and you think, I've worked on loads of languages that are pretty similar to this, that come from a very similar part of the world or are linked in the same language family as this new one. What could I possibly not have come across before? And there's always something that makes it unique. There's, languages are not well-behaved things. They all have a mind of their own. They all will trip you up when you least expect it. You think you've got all the answers and then all of a sudden you find the exception to the rule. And that's a beautiful thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be really frustrating sometimes. But overall, I think it's a beautiful learning curve that we're all very privileged to be on.
Is there any rule that maybe when you were learning or researching about the new language that surprised you the most?
Interesting. I mean, so many. off the top of my head. The last but one language that I worked on was Slovene, and I thought, what could I possibly have to know about Slovene? I've worked on lots of very similar languages, and then I come across the dual plural. So Slovene has two plural forms. One for the dual, so for two of the thing, and then the plural, which is three or more of it. So there's a different word for two apples than there is for three apples. Never come across that before. And then for What3Words, the really interesting point about this is that usually that's just the way it is, and you use the right form of the word when you're translating some content. But What3Words brings up a whole other question of, okay, and how would you feel about the dual or the plural if it came up in a What3Words address? Like, is that okay? Because in English, apple and apples are both perfectly common, obvious, valid words that you would expect to see in a What3Words address. But, I sort of had to find out from the Slovene language team, like, do you feel the same about the dual and the plural and the singular? Are they all words that we can add into the mix that you wouldn't mind coming up in What3Words addresses? And the answer was yes, so they're all there. We've not actually done this language yet, but I'm a bit of a language geek, and I do sometimes just read about languages that I haven't worked on yet because I want to. I found out that in Somali, nouns can often change their gender when they're in the plural. So singular noun and its plural aren't necessarily the same gender.
That's interesting.
I don't know. I've not asked any Somali speakers yet, but I will do one day, and I'll let you know.
Yeah, if you're listening and you're a Somali speaker, please get in touch with Jamie. All right, let's move on to something else, maybe outside of what you normally do or not. What are you curious about right now?
I think there are two big things that I would want to say. The first one I'm actually not going to say because I think everyone is saying it at the moment.
I was going to ask you.
I am curious about how AI is going to change the languages industry, but so is everyone else, so I'm not going to say that. I am curious about how technology is going to change the use of language. I think, we're still in the very early stages of the technological era. It feels like we're sort of way into it, but I think in the grand scheme of things, we're really not. And I want to know, What3Words is localizing into lots of languages, more languages than most technology localizes into. What is the impact that tech companies choosing, often for financial reasons, what languages they're going to offer? What impact is that going to have on the rest of the languages in the world? Like numbers that we're all familiar with. There's 7,000 languages in the world, of which half are expected to become extinct in the next, I don't know what it is, 50 years maybe. That still leaves us with 3.5 languages that are going to be around in 100 years' time. What will use of those languages be looking like in a technological era where we're all attached to our phones, but we can't use them in our native language? That's what I'm curious about. And I think it's a really important question because, as we all know, language is so intrinsically linked to our sense of self and our community and our culture, and it roots us to who we are and where we're from. And language death, I think, is a very important topic that we should all be talking about. And localization professionals are the ones maybe that can do the most to keep languages alive, and to make sure that languages are still being used. And I don't think it's necessarily just on those language communities that speak that language themselves to keep the language alive. I think it's everybody's responsibility. And technology, I think, has the power to marginalize a lot of languages, but it also has the power to do the exact opposite if it's used in the right way, and if it's used by people who care about preserving languages. So yeah, that's what I'm curious about. How are we collectively going to make sure that the right thing happens?
Is there anything that you're curious about that's not related to languages? Like personally? I don't know. Or are you really such a geek that you spend your whole free time researching about languages and how to save the
A large
extinct
proportion
ones?
of it. I'm curious about who's going to win Wimbledon this weekend.
Okay.
I'm curious about. It's a little bit too close to language, but curious about the world, about culture and history and things not being the same as they are at home, and why, and experiencing that. And I just went to Uzbekistan, and we travelled down essentially what was the Silk Road, to Samarkand, which is a city that I'd only really heard of quite fleetingly in my life, and most people that I talked to at home had never heard of. And it's the most incredible place I'd ever been to. It's like walking into the 15th century in the middle of Central Asia on the route that people were trading between Asia and the rest of the world. And the opportunity to be able to go and do that, I think, is mind-blowing. I have a personal, I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to, I like being able to put things in boxes and have numbers and be able to quantify things. I always want to have visited more countries than there are years in my age. So I'm currently 42 years old and I've been to 49 countries. So I'm sort of always trying to keep that number.
You have a buffer.
Yeah. Because I'm going to need it when I'm old. When I'm 80, I'm not going to be traveling to more countries. So I've got to have a 20-year buffer at that point.
Well, once you're 80, you have no idea how the travel is going to look like. Maybe just all in virtual reality.
Who knows? You're absolutely right.
Okay. I'm going to ask you this question because I ask pretty much everyone, although I guess the term our industry means something different to you than for the rest of my guests. And we already touched on this, why that is different for you. But my question is that I ask everyone, what do you think is wrong with our industry?
I think in general, and we've touched on this before, so I'm sort of cheating, sorry. But to answer this question, what is wrong with our industry is that localization and an understanding of languages is looped in too late to the majority of projects and things that people are doing. I think localization professionals in every company should be invited to project meetings earlier, should be invited to give their opinion and improve the process for that project. I think localization professionals have a very important thing to say that is often missing from the room. So the thing that is wrong in our industry is we're not looped into projects early enough.
Final words from you, Jamie. If you could speak to the minds of everyone in the industry, what would you tell them?
I would say evangelize, keep on talking about what you're doing, keep on getting people excited about what you're doing, keep on showing people the value of what you do. And that's, like we were saying before, not only financial. Keep on being the one who is always asking that question or talking about it yeah, just talk about languages and people will listen because deep down everyone is interested in it.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the interview, Jamie.